Hey folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. It's Dan. Before we get this week's show started, a couple quick announcements once again. I'm really excited to have you guys take a listen to this week's show. My guest is Mr. Scott Holden from Thatman on Fatman. It's a completely different kind of show than I've featured before, but one I equally enjoy, and I think that you will too. It's all about Kevin Smith in the Kevin Smith universe, and really an independent podcaster that has sort of taken things to a really high level in the podcasting world and beyond. And Scott and I are going to talk all about it, and I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. But before I bring you that conversation, I wanted to give you one quick Patreon update. I've had a few more people jump on board. This show is basically made possible by listeners like you guys through your iTunes reviews, through your sharing and your social media channels of choice, but also recently through Patreon. There's a link in the show notes, folks. If you would like to jump on the bandwagon, I've got a few recent people that I really appreciate, and I want to take just a moment up front here to thank. So recent Patreon supporters, in addition to those that I've announced previously, Ray Laughlin from Couple Things Podcast. Couple Things has been a longtime friend of the show, and one of the two gentlemen on the show, Ray, has jumped on board representing the show as a whole, I understand. And so I really thank Ray and Couple Things for supporting the Podcast Digest. Next up was Jules Wong from Pocket Now Weekly. Over a year ago, I featured an interview with Michael Fisher from Pocket Now, and Jules Wong is their producer, and he jumped on board as well. So Jules, thank you very much. And one of my favorite podcast newsletters, The Audio Signal, is authored by a woman named Dana Gerber-Margie. You actually heard me mention her a couple of weeks back on my episode with the Kitchen Sisters. She's also a former guest on a recommendations episode, and Dana jumped on the Patreon bandwagon as well. So I'm going to have links to their work as well in the episode notes, show notes for this week's show. So check out a couple things, Pocket Now Weekly and the podcast newsletter, The Audio Signal. And I thank you guys very much. It means a lot to me to have folks out there supporting the show, and I'm going to do you proud, folks. So let's get right to this week's show. One that I think you guys are really going to find interesting. I thought it was a great conversation, and so let's get to meet Mr. Scott Holden. Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week is a little bit different kind of show than I featured previously on the Podcast Digest, but I know there are a lot of fans of this guy's work and his show and the universe he's a part of, and I know he's doing some wonderful things that we're about to talk about. So I'm really honored to welcome to the Podcast Digest from Thatman on Fatman, Mr. Scott Holden. Scott, welcome.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm really glad to talk to you. It's something we talked about last year sometime, and I've always sort of kind of had in my back pocket that I knew I wanted to talk to you, but I wanted to make sure that the timing was right, and I've been kind of on this ring in a row of sort of storytelling and technology, and I felt that this would be the perfect time to make sure that my audience knows about the great work that you're doing. For anybody who doesn't know, what in the world is Thatman on Fatman, Scott?
Thatman on Fatman is best summarized as a fanboy podcast, and in particular what I focus on is the world and the extended universe of Kevin Smith, also known as @ThatKevinSmith, also known as Fatman, also known as the Clerks guy, and so on and so forth.
Well, and I want to put this out front because I think it'll lay the groundwork for our conversation here, Scott. So I love Kevin Smith, but not like you do. But I do have a few Kevin Smith cred. For one, I've been to Red Bank and I've been to the store. Okay. I've been outside of the video store and the convenience store from Clerks. All right. I've walked those aisles. I've seen the milk. Okay. And on the wall of the room I'm podcasting from is a Jay and Silent Bob poster signed from that store in Red Bank. So those are my qualifications. Hopefully I can communicate with you.
Dude, if you've seen Clerks, that's enough bona fides for me. But yeah, I just love the world that I've kind of always been a fan of. And yeah, his book sort of inspired me to start podcasting, and that's sort of pay him back, I guess. And also to keep It's a long story.
And we're going to get into a little bit of that because one's sitting here listening to this, hearing about you and this show for the first time, and they're wondering, a podcast all about Kevin Smith. How in the world does that happen? Now, you've told the story about reading, and I believe you said you actually listened to it on Audible, one of Kevin's books, and sort of that was the launching pad. But I want to go back before that, way before you even picked up that book. Was it Clerks itself that started this attraction towards Kevin?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It was actually the buddy that I ended up podcasting with ultimately first, my friend Joe Greshko. He was a film nerd, and it was the 90s, and we were slackers, and I'm the same age as Kevin. I live in Jersey. We live in Jersey. I live in North Jersey. Kevin's more south, the shore area. Now they've created some central Jersey thing that really didn't exist when we were growing up. It was north or south. This is a creation, I think, more of Craigslist. But, yeah. So my friend Joey just came to us and said, there's this guy in South Jersey who's made a movie, and he was inspired by Robert Rodriguez, and, so we should go and see it. And he was very involved in that thing. So he put it on the radar.
What was it other than that? Were you always like a big movie fan growing up, and Kevin was the first sort of director-actor that kind of really struck a chord with you, or was this just kind of random that you weren't really a big movie TV person beforehand? What other interests did you have kind of coming up?
You know what? I think that the generation known as the slacker generation or whatever, the born at 1970 or in around thereof, I think we were all raised on TV. And I think if you're like me, Star Wars had a huge impact on your life. And so that changed my life and sort of made me see cinema as something different. And then you had Superman and Clash of the Titans, even those cheesy ones, and Flash Gordon, and all these sort of movies, I guess, shaped my head and drove me down that more geek path, which back then was not an easy path to tread. Anyone who knows anything, like I said on another show recently, I was an RPG geek, a tabletop D&D guy, and we're still sort of looked down on in the nerd pecking order. So there you go.
It was the young days of sort of the nerd. I'm a few years behind you. I was born in '78, so actually the year of Star Wars, year before Star Wars.
Yeah, 77 was Star Wars. Yeah,
year after. There we go. So I didn't see it in the theater or anything like that, but I do remember explicitly. Fast forward, because what I was doing when Clerks hit it was right during high school. And when you look at Clerks, you can say a million things about it, and I know you have, but a high school guy is like right in the, the main lane for that audience, so to speak. And we immediately took to that, me and my buddies, and that's where it started for me in terms of my fanhood with Kevin, and it just really struck a tone. Was it something similar for you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Can I ask, are you a fan of the band They Might Be Giants?
A little bit. I knew of them. I heard of them. I've listened to them. I wouldn't say huge fan, but I'm definitely familiar with their work.
I kind of see them in that. When I saw Clerks, it was kind of the same thing as the first time I listened to They Might Be Giants. I'm like, this is different. This is speaking to me. I can't tell you exactly why, but it's a black and white movie. It's underproduced, but I guess you could just tell without saying the writing is brilliant because, at 17 or whatever it was, it was probably 24. Even at 24, I didn't have the vocabulary to be like, the writing is brilliant. I was like, these guys, I knew that I loved the way he wrote because I loved the way the characters spoke. I love that fast sort of deadpan delivery. It felt kind of quasi 1930s. So that appealed to me about Clerks.
It felt real, right? It felt like, especially because it was black and white, it almost felt like old home movie, that kind of single cam type, a Blair Witch or The Office style where it was like, this almost could have happened. And because...
Before I saw the footage, when I saw a preview, I thought, oh, it must be shot from the perspective of the video of the security camera, which back then it was very common for those to be in black and white.
And I think for me and my boys, if you will, in high school, it kind of legitimized the way we talk to each other, right? That kind of insults to each other and this kind of laid back attitude and these horrible first jobs that we had, even in high school. It was like this relatability that back in the 90s, and these were some great movies, don't get me wrong, but you don't get that out of Lion King, Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction, and they're excellent films, but that relatability wasn't there. Nobody's holding me off a cliff's edge as a baby,
And I worked for quite a few convenience stores. I worked for Krauser's. I worked for an independent store, which now is a 7-Eleven. I know where it is. So, and I worked a few deli slicers in my time.
So there's a huge relatability there for you.
Yeah.
So you hit this movie, you come upon this movie, then what? Do you immediately start kind of tracking what's his next project, what's out next? Because the internet was just barely a thing at that point. So what happened after Clerks for you?
Yeah, he definitely became part of the wave of new filmmakers that we would follow. We did the Tarantino thing. We were age appropriate. It was the 90s and we were in our 20s. So we fell right into that, indie film thing. And I don't know that any of us, I guess probably Joey and a couple of the other guys had visions and dreams of becoming filmmakers, but not so much that anyone really acted on them. So, but we were into that period, that thing. Eventually we all sort of got jobs towards the end of the 90s in tech. And there you go. We sold out.
So ultimately, obviously, Thatman and Fatman became a thing years and years later. But at that time, and you sort of alluded to it, was this a moment of motivation for you, like it was later when you heard the audiobook, that you thought maybe you'd get into filmmaking, writing, acting? Did any of that cross your mind at this point, or was it just kind of supreme fanhood?
At that point in my life, I was Mr. Rock and Roll, to tell you the truth. I was in my 20s. I was in a band that was fairly decent, and we were doing our thing, and it was like a stereotype out of a bad Disney sitcom. It was about the music, too, man. Right? Yeah. So we were like a Red Hot Chili Peppers ripoff. I frequently use our music on the show because I have rights to it. So you can hear it each week.
So you're into the Red Hot Chili Peppers style of music. You're into the band. That was kind of what you thought would happen.
Yeah, that was definitely my creative outlet. Plus, with that came all the audio gear. So I had a band, and at the same time, I also started an audio company and a lighting company, because when you get a band, you start getting this gear, then your other bands start asking, hey, can you do my show? So I was doing a lot of that. And then there was another guy in town who sort of had it was the Morristown Community Theater. It's still here. It's got another name. I can't remember what it is right now, but he had that sewn up, but he would sublet a lot of jobs out, throw us work. So I was working in there too. That's how I met George Carlin, which was an awesome, moment for me, being a huge fan.
That would have been awesome.
Yeah, I was a spot operator on 3 of his shows. Wow. Two at Morristown, and then on top of that, they were like, he appreciated the work we did so much that he was like, hey, can you guys work this gig up in the Catskills? So next thing you know, we're basically trucking out to the Catskills, setting up the stage for a show at the Catskills. It was a cool little couple days.
So we're going to get to later on in this story in a minute where you did meet Kevin, but by that point, you'd met George Carlin. Kevin should have been easy. No disrespect, but
that was very random. But it was, don't get me wrong, it was very cool. And I even have his autograph, but God, it's boxed away somewhere. I've been digging around for it recently. I'm like, where is it? I got to find it. So if you're out there, if you're prayers, not that I am, pray for something very important. Like I find my George Carlin autograph.
Well, I know you don't need any more projects right now, Scott, and we're going to get to that too, but I've not heard of, and maybe there is such a thing, but I've not heard of a George Carlin-based podcast. So maybe you got a second show that maybe you could pursue at some point.
No, you could say that his daughter's show is kind of a George Carlin-based podcast, but not really.
I'll go with that. Not in the way that you've given the Kevin Smith treatment to your show. So you're in the music, you're in the lighting. How does this double back around to where we found the launch of Thatman on Fatman?
Well, so then, like I said, like most of us, we got older and got jobs. I was also a technology nerd. So that was the field I pursued. I got into IT management. So that gave me the third piece of the triad. I had the music. I had the entertainment piece. I had the sound piece from doing music. And now I added the technology piece, which was my career. After a long period, essentially, I listened to Howard Stern most of my life until probably I moved to Virginia in my career. And I always listened to talk radio in some form, whether it be, back in the early aughts, I'm always a crazy lefty. So I was big into Air America. And I followed that whole sort of audio journey.
Yeah, Mark Maron.
Yeah, exactly. So many people came out of that. Mark Maron came out of that. Liz Winstead. I didn't even realize Frank Conniff was in there writing for them. So, yeah, there's a lot going on there. That more than like a lot of podcasts were sort of launched out of there. And Al Franken, too.
Yeah.
A senator. So, so I've always been a listener of audio, and I think subconsciously I've always been building my show, because secretly I've always kind of wanted to do this ever since I listened to Howard. So,
Nice. So how did it become real? So did you pick up the audiobook just because by this point you're a general Kevin fan?
Yeah, failure is how it happened. Yeah, I've always been following Kevin's career. Ironically, as I said recently, I never followed him on the podcasting journey until after I read the book. And I even remember talking to this guy in my office and him telling me, oh yeah, Kevin started this podcast. It's really funny. You should check it out, around the time it started. Because we were talking about where he was going with his career. He was the only guy in the office who was also kind of a fan. So, and I remember like really kind of dismissing the podcasting thing at the time. Because I was, Mr. Hotshot, fucking IT guy. What did I know? So, yeah, I kind of was dismissive of podcasting when it was first introduced to me. Like many. Yes.
Looking back, all the irony.
Yes, just like Judas. Or when he, what's his name? Anyway. So when it actually becomes a reality is when the bottom drops out of my life and, we had all the scorecards read 0 and I was stone cold sober, man. When you're fucking drinking, having your life fall apart around you makes sense. But when you're not and you're doing all the right things, when your life falls apart around you, like, what the fuck? I hope I can swear on this podcast.
Sure, go ahead.
So I had, this midlife crisis. If you remember back in 2009, the stuff started to go bad. We were upside down in our house. I lost my job. I was laid off, and we tried to make a go of it, and it didn't work out. So we had to come back to New Jersey and move in with the folks and, totally get humble and feeling like shit and, just in a really bad place. And after a couple months of that, I knew I saw Kevin's book and I got it on Audible. And I think I had the file sitting there for a couple weeks, maybe even a couple months before I finally listened to it. And who'd have thought that, from, the funny guy I like, to watch his videos of, like my life is going to change.
So let me ask you this, Scott. When you hit play on that, you weren't looking for a way to change your life. I'm guessing, given the state of affairs at that point, you were looking for a break, maybe looking to laugh a little bit. And look at what you found.
Yes, totally. I was looking to escape.
Well, and you escaped all right. So from that point on, it just kind of struck a tone with you. And folks, I'm going to direct you guys to Scott's recent episode of Thatman on Fatman, his 2-year anniversary show. And I know they're probably sprinkled in several other episodes, right, Scott? But I know on that one, you do a great job of kind of rehashing the whole history of the show. And you tell a great version of the story. I think you even inserted the audio clip specifically that really struck the tone with you, right?
Yeah, that is the case. And big shout out to Dr. Squee, who helped co-host that, and I stole that idea from him. So that's why I had to have him host that show.
Excellent. That's a great episode. So you come to the point where you're launching this show, and what I was curious about specifically was back then when you said, I think I want to do this. You've got all these other pieces from your experience. You've heard the audiobook. You decide to launch this thing. What were your expectations from the beginning? What did you think was really going to happen?
Well, the first thing I launched was Bone Crushing Juggernaut, which was ironically, I turned to this buddy of mine, Joe Greshko, our friend of 25 years. Since I had just returned to town, we were reestablishing ties. He's also, still a nerd, still a geek, and still played video games. And just from that, I'm like, you know what? I bet you I can get this guy to podcast. And I know that he'd make a good podcaster because he's interesting. So I asked him, and sure enough, he said yes. So we started Bone Crushing Juggernaut. And the way that came about was simple. I had an old band that sort of failed. So I had all that artwork and stuff lying around and the name, and boom, we were off and running. Because we figured the name was arbitrary. However, it ended up fitting in its own. It had the right flavor for what the show became, which was more, it was meant to be a geeky talk show, but it really became about two middle-aged men struggling with being middle-aged and still feeling 25 inside.
So how come the first entree into podcasting wasn't Kevin Smith centric? Did you think that you had to have a co-host and you weren't sure that he'd be as willing to give it to go as you would, or was it not quite even an idea yet to kind of center things around him?
You know what? I think it might have been in the back of my mind. I knew I wanted to talk about, Kevin stuff, because how could I not? It was so, a part of my doing this. So, and I was so inspired. And now, after listening to the book, I dove into the podcast. So I started listening to back archives, and then I was like, oh my God, and tell him Steve Dave. And, so I was like one of those guys who just, took it all in, dove in, deep dive. And, so, I became an animal. So I don't think I felt like I had the right to do a Kevin show. That was even a stumbling block before, I even did it, was who am I to do a Kevin Smith-based podcast? That was part of my struggle because, I don't have an answer for that.
You didn't think your fanhood was up to par.
Yeah, indeed. And I don't know. I just didn't feel right about it until I did.
Well, and nowadays, nobody would question that. I think you've more than earned those stripes there, Scott.
Yeah, so, I think that was it. I really did feel self-conscious. And that is one of the first things I think most podcasters struggle over any show when they kind of come up with one. It's like, who the fuck am I? What expertise, why is my expertise good enough? You can really shoot yourself down with that. And so you got to and Kevin's book helped me get over that. I don't give a shit. I'm just going to be funny with my friend and hope for the best. And It doesn't have to be, at that point, it didn't have to be a career. It didn't have to be, the only thing I wanted to do. It just had to be, it was just better than it was better than being depressed and wanting to kill myself, really.
I want to play a little role reversal here, Scott. I want to give you, as long as you want, to kind of play the role of Kevin here. Somebody out here is listening to this, because I know I have these types of listeners on the Podcast Digest thinking about starting their own show. You made that leap, and we see how it's worked out. if somebody else out there is thinking, I'm hearing the story of this guy who wasn't sure and this, that, and the other, as you were able to pull something from Kevin's message, what message would you want to tell that person hearing this right now about the idea of starting this, or maybe starting any project, maybe starting a blog or a piece of artwork, or their own business or whatever? What kind of advice would you want them to hear?
I'd say that they have to act themselves into right thinking. So, it's so frequent that we come up with ideas and then we kind of want to talk ourselves into it, and we want to go and here's a good piece of advice I would tell you. If you have a good idea, don't share it, because many times in sharing your idea, and this is iffy too, you can kind of feel this, but I know I've experienced this. In sharing that idea, you sort of get the juice out of it that, like, you could have gotten from actually doing it. You know what I mean? It's sort of like telling somebody fulfills it somehow, and so you don't have to do it.
Right.
So if you get really good ideas, don't necessarily run to everybody. My advice, make tracks, do it. Just pull the trigger. Figure out the ingredients that you need. If you don't know how, I was just interviewing a guy for the movie. He was a comedian. He went to a studio and said he made a deal, and boom. And I said, so you didn't do it yourself? He's like, no, fuck that. I'm a comedian. I don't want to have to worry about any of that shit. I just want to come in and do this. You know what I mean? So I lost my train of thought, but however you feel you can do it, just do it. Take the action. There's so much more power in action than in sitting there and thinking. So
don't necessarily plan ahead too much.
If you have your idea, great. I think it was me and Mr. BS, because, God, the guy's been all over the place lately. We were talking about it was on my show. I wasn't sure if it was on his show or my show, but we were talking about that. Well, now the market is so filled up with this kind of show or that kind of show. Do you really need to start one? And it all comes down to, what is your need to start the show to begin with? What are you looking for? What are you looking to get out of this? So when I started, long story short, at first it was to not be depressed. And if I had a long-term goal, it was that I hoped that Joe and I could kind of form a stand-up like act that we could do in clubs for fun. And it would sort of take the place of a band in my life. So that really was if I had a long-term goal when I started podcasting, that was it.
Before I get into sort of the evolution of Thatman on Fatman, I want to jump into kind of how the show has changed over time. But before I even get into that, I want to talk a little bit about your, per the website, producer extraordinaire. That's Jean, and that's your wife, correct?
Yes, indeed.
First of all, before we even get even further into that, I know people are listening, might want to know, how's she doing?
She is doing well. She's recovering. She's now physically, you couldn't tell anything about her, and we're pretty sure mentally she's okay, but you never know with her.
Well, that's good to hear. I know that the last episode that's out there as of the day of this recording, there were still questions. So I'm glad to hear that she's doing well. But for folks who don't know, how in the world did your wife get involved with this show?
Okay. Well, it's kind of simple, and I would also chalk it up to advice to podcasters out there. So the way I transitioned, so I had Bone Crushing Juggernaut going, and I was essentially beginning to annoy my co-host because I was talking a lot about Kevin. In much the same way, if you've had a friend who talks about Game of Thrones or The Flash or whatever it is, some show that they obsess about that you don't watch, you start to kind of hate on it, even though, you may have never seen it or not. It's just that kind of thing. So I was doing that to him with Kevin, even though he liked Kevin. I was beginning to turn him off to Kevin with all my Kevin talk. So I realized maybe I need to start a second show, and it's where I can exercise all these demons and keep Bone Crushing Juggernaut going, so that someday we could have the stand-up comedy thing going. Well, so that's what it did. had an idea to do another show based on Kevin. Came to me like a flash. Kevin had started Fatman on Batman probably within 6 months after I had jumped onto Smodcast. So, and I love that show. I love the interview format. I love the intimacy. And I loved how it was a success recipe. Like each week, someone was telling you how they succeeded. If you listened, if you took out all the comic book and all the Batman stuff, as I told my kids at the time, listen to that show. They're telling you how to succeed. So I love that format. So when the idea came, it all came kind of at once. I'm going to do a show about Kevin. It's going to be called Thatman on Fatman. I'm going to kind of borrow that format. And that was where it launched. And after a little while of doing it, I'm getting there, sorry. I had some, I started booking guests, but then I had to cancel a guest. And I was like, oh shit, this is kind of bad because now I have to cancel on a guest. This will be my first real interaction with them, will be a cancellation. It's a negative. We're starting on a negative. This isn't good. I need a buffer. I need someone to help me kind of book and take the hatchet man job. And that was sort of when I pulled Jean in and said, plus she is so sweet and nice. Like hearing any kind of rejection from her is much better than hearing it from me.
You mentioned a lot of the guests and sort of the guest booking issue over the evolution of the show. And you're approaching or obviously I just mentioned you just passed the 2-year mark. You've had some huge guests, obviously, in and around and connected and pseudo-connected and 6 degrees connected to Kevin's kind of whole career, including Kevin himself. You've told the story many times about how that happened, but kind of what was that like for you? Did you look at that as the pinnacle? Did you look at it as round one? Did you look at it as, part of a series of revisits, or kind of before, during, and after? What was the thought when you finally kind of got there?
Before, obviously leading into, it was so exciting and amazing, and I can't believe this is happening, and wow. And that was, and because of the nature of, there was always a question. It was weird because we had met Kevin a couple of times, but if we're talking about when we met him to sit down to podcast, which was sort of a big goal for the show. It became the Roger and me sort of part of the show. This, can I get Kevin on this Kevin-based podcast? So, yeah, there was a lot of excitement. So there was a lot of that element to it. But when it actually happened, because at first it got the weekend got canceled, and we went to the Tusk screening, and then they contacted, Ashley at the time contacted us and like, it's a go. Kevin wants to do it. So, it was a whirlwind of emotions, all of them positive, all of them exciting. However, there was a bit of like, and it didn't happen at first, but it was within the first few weeks of like, oh my God, wait, whoa. We just accomplished sort of maybe our biggest gag, if you will. Like really much earlier than anyone had anticipated. So yeah, there was a bit of like, what do we do now? We were kind of reeling. But so yeah, maybe there was that this is the first act. But, so like I said earlier, act your way through. And I think that's what I had to do. I kind of kept putting the next foot in front of the other, stringing another guest together, because even though it felt like, is this over now? Did we come to a close? What you forget is like if you play video games, you're sort of down to boss. Now your rep goes up. You gain a level. You can now have the access to other guests that you never thought you would have access to before. And it's just because of the simple reputation. Like they'll go, who's been on your show? Kevin Smith. Oh, okay, I'll be on. As simple as that. So you don't really realize that at the time, because but as time goes on, you realize, oh, I am not, this is a big hurdle. It's not the end of the show. It can be the beginning. So, and little did we know we had a movie in us. So life happens in weird ways.
And there might almost be something to be said, Scott, and I'm gonna pitch a extraordinarily controversial theory for you, okay? That maybe having Kevin on to especially a super fan listener might almost be one of the less interesting episodes. Now, hear me out, and the reason I say that is because they probably have followed Kevin. They've seen every interview he's done with this show and that show and read the book and read this biography and this write. Like, they feel like they've got a pretty good handle. But some of the other guests you've had, different roles in the filmmaking process and writers and actors, and they may hear a perspective that isn't often given voice, and that can truly give them a whole new perspective on Kevin the man or his work or whatever the case may be, and they may get more interest out of even some of the other guest lists that you've had. Is there any value to that, or am I just crazy?
Oh, definitely. Because when I go back, it's funny that you say that because you snap me back into reality. When I go back and hear that now as a podcaster of that many more shows since I did that show, I hear a very fucking nervous guy. I hear a guy who is so nervous, my questions became a crutch, as opposed to, if I did that again, the first thing I would do is chuck my questions, throw them away, because as I got nervous, I've seen the footage a couple times now. I got so nervous because, I was meeting a hero that I became affixed. And I couldn't be me. I became like an anchor, and I asked questions because they were sort of on my script that in second thought, shouldn't have asked or shouldn't have brought up because they were just, not good questions.
Well, it didn't come across too much in the recording, at least when I heard it. Now,
editing helps a lot. If you see the raw video footage, it's very interesting because even Kevin, thank God, Kevin is a podcaster, and he's like, you hear him encouraging me, and he keeps reminding me, it's okay, editing.
Yeah, he was kind of almost like, I don't want to say taken aback, that might be too strong, but he kind of had almost a fascination with you, like, you're doing a show on me, you rock, right? He kind of had that tone to it all.
Yeah, there's a lot of weirdness there that I can see from his perspective too.
Right.
And what you also realize once you cross that bridge is Kevin probably does a lot more podcasts than we know of. But if he doesn't tweet about them, how are you going to know? If like some little podcast, with a couple hundred followers or whatever, has him on or has, and is able to, Kevin only sort of retweets the big boys.
Well, what would be interesting is if someday, and I'm not going to say this is impossible, Scott, on the next topic we're going to talk about here in just a minute, but someday if somebody creates a some man on that man, where this whole role gets reversed someday, where somebody does a podcast about you, wouldn't that be ironic? It would be funny if this whole thing comes full circle, 15 years from now or something.
That means I have to do something more than just be a Kevin Smith fanboy.
Well, I think you are, and that's what I wanted to talk to you next about. You made a mention of it just for a quick minute, and it's one of the things that really kind of made me want to talk to you because I think what you're doing is so interesting. Can you tell people about this film project you've got? Lay it out for them.
Sure. No, not a problem at all. Matter of fact, I enjoy talking about it. If you're a listener out there and you're thinking, should I start a podcast? There's another wonderful thing about starting a podcast. It's also like the same effect of starting a band. You just get in this creative mode. Creativity becomes a part of your regular life. You're thinking about your show. You're thinking about bits. You're thinking about how can your show be better? How can you be funny? Whatever your show is. So you get in this creative mode. And if you're doing your show with other people, it becomes like a clubhouse. And that clubhouse spawns other ideas. Now, we had Malcolm Ingram on, and Malcolm Ingram is Kevin's good friend and also a documentary filmmaker. He's made a Small Town Gay Bar. His more recent project, Out to Win, is about athletes coming out. So he's, become very successful in his own right, owes it all to Kevin, acknowledges it. So he's on our show and he's talking. And I just remember at one point going, boy, if I could, and the way he walks you through the way he shoots his docs was just like, wow, I could do that. He just laid it out. It's easy. And he's like, well, what about editing? Well, he's like, well, I use an editor. I'm like, fuck, yeah, that's dope. Yeah, that would take the sting out. Now, as it turns out, I want to edit. So, but, just the fact that every hurdle he sort of had an answer for made me realize, hey, I could do a documentary and I know exactly what I would do it on. I'd do it on podcasting. The lights went off, and like with Thatman on Fatman, it was one of those eureka moments. I couldn't let it go. It stuck with me. A couple weeks later, it was still following me around. So then we had Bob Hawke on the show for the second time. Those of you who don't know, Bob Hawke was instrumental in bringing Clerks to the public consciousness. Kevin has said without Bob Hawke, he doesn't think there would be a Clerks. So having access to this guy has been amazing. First off, he's just an amazing person. He's very welcoming of artists and people doing creative projects of all kinds. But and the only reason he came on our show, as far as we could tell, was because our show was specifically about Kevin. I think if it was just a movie show or whatever, he might have looked the other way. But because it was Kevin specific, he embraced it. So we hit it off the first time we met, and our first time we had him on the show, and then we went out to dinner after, and it was a great time. So the second time, now I had this idea. I kind of dropped it on the table. He thought it was a great idea. Now it's like, wow, I got this idea. I've got Bob Hawke who's like, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's do it. And we were off and running. We started spitballing ideas. Now, if you know podcasting, everybody's like, pod people, pod this, pod. I was like, I think I know what it is. I think I want to call it What's a Podcast? Because it's the first thing every podcaster hears when they start telling people.
We've all heard that question, that's for sure.
Exactly. So I wanted it to be an inside joke to all those people who have started podcasts out there. And, I kind of knew in a nutshell. Came to me, I knew sort of the story I wanted to tell. I want to lay out the history of podcasting, but I also want to tell sort of my personal story in there, like why I'm telling this story to begin with, and show how it's changing people and changing lives and bringing people closer together. And I don't know, I just want to pay homage to all this stuff. And it's been an amazing journey.
So we're recording for posterity's sake on the evening of March 22nd, 2016. At this juncture, Scott, where are you in this process in terms of filming and production? How far have you come? How much longer do you think you've got? Where do you stand?
You actually caught me in that really shitty period. If you've ever talked to filmmakers, it's like I have. I remember talking to, the first time I probably talked to the guys doing shooting Clerks. I think I hit them in and around this phase. So if I don't sound like Mr. Hey, this is great, it's because you don't, when you get in this, I think there's a certain blind ignorance, and, ignorance is bliss.
It's not all glitz and glamour.
Yeah, but you're so enthusiastic and fired up. It shields you from a certain amount of the realities that you don't really know yet.
It sounds like being a parent.
Yes, it really is. It's a lot like that. It's very much so. Exactly. It's a great analogy.
Sounds better in concept than reality.
Yeah, your film is your baby. And it's so very true. So, and it's not just me. I'm seeing this as universal, because if you've listened to Fatman on Batman, recently had the documentary filmmaker who made Superman Lives. Are you familiar with that?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's the story of the Tim Burton Superman story that didn't happen. Nicolas Cage was supposed to be Superman, and so Kevin's in it. He gives some commentary because he was one of the first script writers. But that documentary filmmaker talks about, they interviewed him for the show, and he says, yeah, I thought 3 to 6 months and we're done. And, then we'll be we'll be done shooting, then we can edit and we'll be done, I thought the same shit. And that is the only person who knew that was not how it worked was Bob. And it's funny, when he said at the time, we all kind of laughed and thought, oh, what does he know? But he was like, you'll be filming a year from now. So, we haven't been filming a year yet. In May, it'll be a year. But yeah, we've been filming a long time.
What would you say, midpoint-ish?
Yeah. It's sort of weird because it's good and bad. The longer you shoot, depending on, it's sort of like I was talking about before, the better guests you get, the more access you get to better guests. So having Kevin in the film and having all these people, opens the doors. And then, like recently, we were able to get Neil deGrasse Tyson in the film, and that has opened more doors. So your shooting starts to become longer because you are getting more valuable footage. But then you have your people who've been hearing about this thing because of a podcast, since its inception, are like, where's the movie? But, these things take a lot longer than we think.
So do you have a target length?
I'm shooting for 120 minutes.
Yeah.
Which may be cut down to 90. We'll see.
And do you have a dream release date? Obviously, I'm sure that question has been revised. That answer's been revised several times. But at this point, what are you thinking?
I really think it is realistic, based on everything, for us to have something out Q1 of 2017.
There you go.
So, and we're, our affiliation with Bob Hawke gives us no advantage. However, a goal on our plate is to make it to Sundance, or at least to make it into the entry for Sundance.
That would be awesome.
Obviously, I could make a shit film and they could not get in. And, I don't think Bob, but I do not think Bob will allow that.
Yeah, a lot of 16 left to go. We'll see what happens. When you were telling that story, Scott, I had this thought cross my mind, and I'm thinking to myself, am I just seeing something into all this, or has this kind of settled upon you as well? You first got attracted to Kevin Smith's work with Clerks, and we were talking about Clerks at the start of this conversation, and we talked about sort of how it was real and black and white and talk like people do and so on and so forth, and that was his first big entree into the world, so to speak. And now, all these years later, you have a significant role in a documentary that is obviously real, and it's your first big film work and so on. So is there some kind of repetitive history here, or am I just reading way too much into this?
Maybe I do believe in karma after all. I can't say other than I think I ended up right where I was supposed to be.
Right.
As much as I might have, kicked and taken some wrong turns along the way and fought and, but yeah, all I could say is I regret that I lost 20 years, but there wasn't podcasting until there was podcasting. And that was really the ingredient that I needed to be able to say, I can do this again. So, I don't know. I ramble a lot nowadays.
A couple of ways to look at that, right? You either lost 20 or you saved the next 20, right? Because now you're on this road.
There you go. That is true. If there is any lesson in life if there's anything that I want to impart on people too, is because when I turned 40, I thought my life was over. I really did. On top of realize I was unemployed at the time. I thought about when I was 40, I'm like, God, if someone had told me, because when I was like 30, I was on top of the world, IT, bigwig, promotions, things were going on, it was the height of all that stuff. When I turned 40, it was like, I'm going backwards. So if I can impart anything to anyone out there, it's that life does not have to end at 40. It really doesn't. And you can have a second career and a second shot. It's there. Just don't give up hope.
Well, as somebody who's 37, I love hearing that.
Yeah, I mean, I've in the last couple of years, for sure, I packed so much more experience, so much more of an awesome life, like living the dream. And now, granted, there's a lot of sacrifice that goes with it. The financial security, you got to learn to live with some financial insecurity in your life, particularly if you're a filmmaker. But I don't mind that today because, the trade-off is so much more worth it.
Scott, you were talking about a little bit ago about how when you started the first podcast, Bone Crushing Juggernaut, that it was kind of like this creative cabin where you and your buddies were together and all these ideas started to come over the years and it just kind of got the creative juices flowing. Has getting into filmmaking sort of had the same similar experience, and can you see this initiative kind of going beyond what's a podcast? Is there a second?
Yes, I already have. Yes, exactly. That's exactly how it happens. I already have mine. And in some respects, I think I already had project number 2 as I had project number 1, because that grew out of a conversation that Bob Hawke and Gene and I had at our first dinner. So, like, he almost planted the seed in our first dinner to turn us into filmmakers. That motherfucker. He's a pusher.
Next 3 years of my life down the tubes.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it becomes too. You don't realize it, but that's what he's doing. But yeah, so yeah, I already do have another project in the works. I can't really talk about it just yet.
No, that's fine.
And I've also you talk about irony before when you were saying, not that you're making films. How about this? I have the opportunity to shoot second unit for the film, shooting Clerks, where I'm directing the second unit director, Scott Schiaffo, in a pickup shot as Kevin Smith's father.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like, now hang on. Now I'm going to double down. And through the course of working with the director and him just hearing my voice, for whatever reason, he's Scottish. I preface that by saying he's Scottish. He thought that my voice had a similarity enough to Howard Stern to cast me in the movie as Howard Stern. So I'm also shooting myself as Howard Stern. I got a whole side of lines as Howard.
Wow.
Yeah, I had the wig. I was all teased out last night. It was, so that's sort of like, it's another hero of mine. I mean,
that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's all coming back.
I know, it really is. It's so fucking weird. And the only person who really understands this stuff is Gene and Joey he's the only guy who understands all these touchstones. So, yeah.
But I think there's one more, and please excuse me if I actually missed this happening. I think I would have caught it, but maybe I didn't. But I think there's one thing left right before Q117, when What's a Podcast is about to debut. Don't you make an appearance on Kevin's show?
I don't know.
That would be completing the circle.
That would be amazing. However, with him being in the film, that increases our chances. But it's weird, right? Because here's the thing.
That would be the icing, though, right, Scott?
Yeah. Here's the thing. Kevin I know that personally, he could tell he loves the show because he supports it and he's done so much for us sort of quietly, but it's been more quiet. And it's because I think he has this feeling that if he does sort of come out and really, like he says in that intro that we use, he does feel sort of gross, like to fluff us up is to fluff him up.
Right.
So, yeah, so he has this, as much as I know he likes, like he sort of didn't admit to liking to listening to the show. But I know that if someone did a show on me, I'd be listening.
It'd be hard to resist.
Yeah, and I think I know Kevin well enough that just from listening to his stuff that I can't see him not listening.
Well, I think it would be an excellent way to kind of tie up this last like 5-year journey of yours. Once the film gets released, we'll be approaching that number, maybe 3 or 4. But it would be an awesome way to kind of put a bow on all this. I mean, it looks like you've checked so many of those irony boxes all along already, and I think it's awesome. I'm a big Kevin Smith guy myself, as we talked about in the beginning. So your show caught my attention pretty early when we first connected on Twitter, and I've been enjoying it. And I'm hoping that nothing significant changes in the Mallrats 2 production schedule, because what last I heard now was June or July.
Yeah.
After it got bumped, because the mall that was at least originally selected, Exton Square Mall, is literally 3 miles from my house. My oldest son works in that mall right now. So if that were to happen, I might have to kind of, drop in.
Well, from being involved in the universe, I know that you would have a good chance of becoming an extra or even a crew member because of, tax breaks of hiring Pennsylvania, people.
Well, I know I was kind of mildly keeping tabs. It was January, and then it moved, and I know there was this earlier conversation about Granite Run Mall that is basically vacant now, and then they moved over to Exton Square Mall. So who knows? I'm trying to maintain tabs on it, though. Let me know if you hear anything.
And let me tell you something. All of that affects us. Isn't that weird? You don't think about it, but it really has, because originally we were supposed to have shot with Kevin in January because they were...
Right. I remember hearing that at one point, that you guys were supposed to get together, and then the delay kind of changed it all. You were supposed to have was it for the film or a second appearance on your show?
It was for the film. We were supposed to shoot for the film, and probably would have been a second appearance on the show. Once you're in the room, push. But and he's a podcaster. I mean, hey, you want a podcast? Yeah. So So we were supposed to shoot with him, but once that changed, then, and if you remember, there's Clerks 3 was in the mix as well. So that's all pushed around. So from what I know, now it's Yoga Hosers. I mean, not Yoga Hosers. It's Moose Jaws. Then once Moose Jaws finishes, come around June, July, they're looking to shoot Mallrats 2.
That would be great. I mean, I'd be interested anyways, but I have to admit, I am that much more interested considering it's literally in my backyard. So when he first made the announcement last fall, it literally set this place on fire. I mean, it was on the local news, everything.
Yeah. Believe me, it's funny because... there were moments in there where I was, in consideration for crew. So it's funny that those fell flat, that those movies, got pushed out. But then we started making a movie somewhere along the line. So it was like, wow, fate again stepped in. So,
well, assuming it happens this summer, Scott, and assuming you will, somehow maybe drop by this area, you're always welcome here, and maybe we try a follow-up in person where we don't have to deal with Skype.
I think when you finally hear my side, you're going to enjoy it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. Before I let you go, please tell everyone where they can find everything about Thatman on Fatman and anything else, where they can see you on Twitter, so on and so forth.
The easiest and the best address to give you is to go to thatmanonfatman.com. There you find links to everywhere else. But on Twitter, I'm Thatman on Fatman. On Facebook, if you type in Thatman on Fatman, I'm pretty sure I'm the guy that comes up. So check us out. I'm Scott Holden as well. That's my name. If you want to personally look for me, I still have personal slots in my Facebook that I will fill up with listeners who want to get in while the getting's good.
Before the world famous comes.
Yeah, exactly. But isn't that weird though, that Facebook, you would figure between the two, Facebook wouldn't have a limit, but they do.
That is strange. Don't get me started on the differences between Facebook and Twitter, because I could go for days. I'll tell you.
The truth of the matter is, you need at least one if you're going to do podcasting now. Although Snap.
Yeah, Instagram and Snapchat are coming on fast.
Well, here, the way it works, I mean, I just had a discussion with a podcaster who's younger by a good 20 years maybe, and that's the tool he uses to reach his audience. And his show is in a venue in an audience sort of that I never even thought of, frat boy comedy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow. I was so glad that, I'm glad I'm interviewing you, because this is a market like we haven't talked about, but this is definitely a good market. So, yeah, he's pushing me even more to think about using Snap. So I'm trying to get into the habit. That's what it's all about. You got to get into the habit.
Yeah, I'm all about going where the people are, and if that's where the people go, that's where I'll be doing.
Well, that's where the young people go. And let's face it, I mean, young people are more likely to listen to a podcast than someone who's like 60.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can tell you this, Scott, young or old folks, if you're listening to this and you like Clerks, you like Mallrats, you like anything Kevin Smith has done, you have to go check out Thatman on Fatman. All the links will be in the show notes that Scott mentioned, and the social media stuff as well. You'll enjoy it. I've been enjoying it. And look out for first quarter 17 for What's a Podcast. It's something that's going to be awesome for all of us in the podcasting community, I think. And Scott, want to thank you for taking the time.
Dude, let me just say, this has been like a bucket list thing for me, to being on your show. I mean, because I'm one of those guys who listened when I was starting up. I listened to you. I listened to Podcaster 101. I listened to all, to get an idea of what I was doing. So this is another full circle moment.
Well, there's no way I'm going to allow myself to be in a list of some of the things you've been doing lately, but I appreciate the compliment nonetheless.
This is such an honor to me. You have no idea, because you're a podcast about podcasting. And I love podcasting.
I'm happy to feature you. I love what you've been doing. I think your story is great, and I think what you're doing with the documentary is even the next level of great. So I'm very happy to have had this chance to sit down and talk to you.
And you're where you're wait, you already told me, and I've already forgotten, because we should probably get in the film.
We'll talk about that. That would be great.
Because now, I mean, I'm going up to Toronto to see Scott Thompson from The Kids in the Hall. So now I'm traveling more. East Coast travel's not as bad as I thought.
Oh, like I said, I am literally right near the Mallrats 2 shooting location. Exton is where the mall is. I'm in Downingtown. If you see them on a map, they are literally minutes from each other. So let me wrap this thing up. Scott Holden from Thatman on Fatman, thank you very much for joining me, folks. That'll do it for this week on the Podcast Digest, episode 84. Come back again next week for another interview with one of your favorite shows. Until then, my name is Dan Lizette.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.